Hey all, California Mick here. Welcome to the New Tribal Mind. I want to talk a little bit right now about journalism and its relationship to the tribal people. And I'm I kind of wrote this out, so I'm going to be a little bit tied to the script, but I am a writer, and I suppose since this is a little bit about journalism, I could sort of justify that reading fits the theme. But anyway, it's kind of a pet peeve of mine that I want to talk about. Um, so here we go. I love journalism. I start my day each day with a cup of coffee or three or four, depending on the day, and an old school print newspaper in my hands. I'm a news junkie to the extent that a therapist once ordered me to take a news vacation when I was fighting depression. The news blackout just added more stress. I've worked as a journalist in the past. I've worked as a news editor and a columnist in the past, and I loved those jobs. I have a deep love for journalism. That said, in articles and newscasts lately that address the divisiveness in American culture and politics right now, I have noticed a disturbing trend in the language used by some journalists and commentators that is historically inaccurate, that is racist, and that is disingenuous. So I felt the need to address my fellow journalists and writers about what I hope is an unconscious misuse of language. So here goes. Dear journalist, stop using the word tribal to describe the divisiveness in our own non-tribal Western culture that we cannot control. And I hate to call you out, but two of the worst offenders of late have been Meghan McCain on The View. I love Meghan McCain, in spite of her being a Republican. She has some really great things to say, but she keeps using that word tribal to refer to anything divisive and warlike and binary. And the other one is Anna Navarro, also a Republican, also somebody that I really like a lot of what she says. She's very angry at Trump. She has a lot of passion, but she keeps using that word tribal to mean divisiveness. And the divisiveness is coming from the Greco-Roman paradigm that we live under. It has nothing to do with the tribal people. So the tribal worldview has never, ever, ever been about binary divisive worldview, but rather a multifaceted, holistic one, like nature herself, from whence the tribal people around the globe throughout history take their wisdom and understanding of the world. Binary thinking, us versus them thinking, this side versus that side thinking, dualities thinking is not a characteristic of the tribal people and never has been. It is a characteristic of the Greco-Roman system that gave us the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire and the monarchies of Europe and the colonialism that spread it to the rest of the world and oppressed people. That binary thinking has nothing at all to do with the tribal people. The tribal peoples were keenly aware that they lived in a world of at least three dimensions. So the idea that anything could be accurately described in the world in terms of only two sides was ludicrous to them. And the idea that everything in the world was two opposing sides at war with each other was even more ridiculous. You would not have found a thinker in the tribal world that ever embrace that. It's a Greco-Roman thing. That's our stuff, not their stuff. That is it is in a three-dimensional world, something having two sides is an abstract concept. It's a physical impossibility. In a three-dimensional world, nothing has just two sides. And the tribal people who took their wisdom from nature recognize this. It's us who think that we're above nature in this patriarchal, hierarchical, binary world that thinks somehow we can make everything into two sides, which makes absolutely no logical sense. It's unscientific. It's irrational. The tribal people always recognize, as science does, that everything is multifaceted, not binary. Thanks to quantum computation, even the binary nature of computers is going the way of the gas lamps and the horse-drawn buggies. Many of the tribal peoples of California, speaking of this insane myth that the tribal people were always at war. That's us that's always been at war ever since the monarchies took over Europe. We've never had peace with this binary system. But the tribal peoples of California, a lot of them did not even have a word in their language for war. War was not something that was even a part of their experience. So they didn't have a word for it. So how can you take the tribal people and make them the example of the source of this fighting and this us versus them in this war? It's just simply not true. It's part of the propaganda of the Greco-Roman system that has vilified the tribal people over and over and over again. We of the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian worldview introduced this insane philosophic and religious obsession with us versus them, good versus evil, heaven versus hell, men versus women, God versus Satan, light versus darkness, to say that the sins of our Western European binary thinking and action is tribal is utter, historic, irrational, philosophic bullshit. You can trace this irrational vilification of the tribal peoples back to the propaganda of Julius Caesar leading up to his war against the tribal Celts. And since Rome won the war, and because we obsessively repeat the myth that the militaristic, misogynist, brutal, patriarchal, punitive, linear, colonizing empire of Rome that lined its streets with crucified people dying slow, painful, bloody deaths and used infanticide and rape as tools of war as a beginning of civilization, we continue to believe the writings of this brutal general against all other historic evidence. You're pretty hard-pressed to take that culture I just described and say that's the beginning of civilization. The tribal peoples were way more civilized than that. It's like learning about the tribal people from Julius Caesar and his writings, like learning about Native Americans from George Custer or from Andrew Jackson. It's not rational. It's ludicrous. And we need to just get over it. We need to stop unthinkingly repeating the views of the dominant power structure that we purport to challenge. Have we not done enough damage to the tribal peoples already without continuing this racist, white supremacist, Eurocentric need to use the tribal people as our scapegoats yet again for the things that we do not have the wisdom or the courage or the philosophic foundation to face in our own damaged, adolescent, binary, oppositional way of seeing the world? Just stop it. You will never successfully challenge the horrors perpetrated by the patriarchy by using language that justifies the horrors of the past that were perpetrated by the patriarchy against the tribal peoples who were not responsible for it. Stop using the tribal peoples as their scapegoat. Just stop it. It's racist and it's wrong and it's irrational and it's not historic. I mean, duh. Are not journalists supposed to be the ones who can step outside the unexamined cultural box and see with a clearer eye? Stop abusing the tribal people by using the word tribal as the ultimate vilification of hateful actions in our culture. We are the source of this divisiveness, and we are not tribal. We are the grandchildren via European monarchies of a colonizing, hierarchical, patriarchal empire that distrusts and uses nature rather than learning to be in harmony as the tribal people always sought to do. Stop being knee-jerk rhetorical stooges to the dominant cultural paradigm by supporting the racist view that the tribes are responsible for everything that goes wrong in a culture that has almost completely wiped those tribal people out. This is not even remotely rational, and you guys are supposed to be the rational ones. Just stop it. Good night and good luck.